Hey, everybody. So it's been almost a year since I recorded a series of conversations with Pastor Dave Johnson about Tim Alberta's incredible book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And those conversations were fascinating and encouraging to me at the time. And they laid a foundation for pretty much everything that I did on this channel in 2024. We recorded these even before I knew that I'd be writing a Christian case against Donald Trump. So this channel had about 350 subscribers back then, which means most of the current subscribers probably haven't seen these videos, and I think they're really important to understanding this channel. So I'm re-releasing them now because I want to provide a way to step back and do some thinking about the bigger picture of how the church got to where we are today and how we can fulfill our calling to be a blessing in the days to come, no matter who's president. So enjoy. Well, welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Conkey, and I'm here today with Pastor Dave Johnson. And this is the first in what is going to be a series of conversations that Dave and I have about the book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism by Tim Alberta. And I want to start by introducing Dave Johnson. Dave Johnson was a pastor for 38 years of Church of the Open Door in, what's the suburb, Rogers, Minnesota now? Close. It was in Minneapolis. So for 38 years, he was the pastor of Church of the Open Door. And he's the author of several books, including one that I want to call out, The Subtle Power of Spiritual Abuse, which he wrote with Jeff Van Vonderen, right? Yep. Several years ago. And I think that book may end up coming into play a little bit in later conversations when we talk about some of what's going on in the church. And he's also right now the head of a ministry called Things That Remain. And Dave, if you just want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing with Things That Remain. I know that I've benefited from it because I've gone to some of your pastor retreats with our friend Ned Berube and others, and those have been just fascinating and, just really helpful to me. But yeah, why don't you talk about what you're doing now?
Well, when I left Open Door, there were a number of reasons. I knew it was time, but I also knew I had juice for something else, and I've been holding it for a very long time. I really care about pastors and leaders of all kinds. It doesn't have to be in a church necessarily. And the whole idea of staying in it for the long haul. And so even the retreat that you came to, Pat, we talked about what it means what it looks like to stay in it. And by it, I don't mean the ministry, I meant the faith. And by faith, I don't mean orthodoxy. I mean being a person full of hope and faith in God all the way to the end, regardless of how successful or not we are. But the Things That Remain thing, but I didn't want to call it. I'm thinking, what did we call it? Things That Remain or Staying in It? And Things That Remain came out of 1 Corinthians 3, where Paul talks about the kind of the measure of our life. And when the fire comes, all the wood, hay, stubble gets burned up. And that sounds very judgmental or frightening. But the analogy there is that wood and hay and stubble is light. It doesn't have substance. But the things that remain are the things that they just mattered. So I want to talk about things that matter. The things that remain after 28 years, after a ministry, after your life. What stayed? What didn't just get burned up? Not in judgment, but it's just like chaff. It just blows away. I don't want to spend my time on things that blow away. So that's where it came from.
So now to get to this book, Tim Alberta, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. This is a fantastic book. I was going to do just one video about it on my YouTube channel, and I thought this book deserves a lot more than one video. I think every chapter has issues in it that are just worth discussing, that are super important. And I thought, who better to discuss this with than Dave Johnson? Because over the years, we've just had conversations together where with our friend Ned and Tim and some others where we get together. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you know this or not, but every once in a while, I just hit record on my phone when you get talking, because I think I don't want to lose this. This is super helpful stuff. It really helps me to process some of what's going on. And so this is like a way of sort of publicly hitting record
Yeah.
and and
Well, can
just
I just
capturing some of this.
about
Yeah.
that quick, because I was at your house with Ned and Tim a week or so ago and smoking a cigar. Is that okay that you smoke a
Yeah, that's
cigar?
fine. Yeah.
You probably don't know. Anyway, um, but I was all jazzed about this book, and I had just gotten it, and I was getting it, and I was starting to talk to you about it, and I didn't know that you had already had it, and so my energy for this was, yeah, I'm all in on this. Yes, really good.
Yeah, it's such a good book. So the title of the book is, the kingdom, the power, and the glory, and it comes from the Lord's Prayer. And it's interesting, the book is laid out in three sections: the section on the kingdom, power, the glory. And Tim Alberta writes, God has his own kingdom. No nation in this world can compare. God has his own power. No amount of political, cultural, or social influence can compare. God has his own glory. No exaltation of earthly beings can compare. And what's striking to me hearing Tim Alberta write this stuff is that Tim Alberta is like a big time elite journalist who, he's getting really personal in this book. He's getting super personal because he's talking from the perspective of both, a very accomplished journalist who knows his craft and spent 4 years on this book, previously as mostly a political journalist, but also as an evangelical, as the son of an evangelical pastor. And his perspective is one that just, I think, needs to be listened to. I would recommend every Christian who wants to think seriously about like the role of politics in our faith, the role of some of the cultural issues that people argue about in our faith. This book is just, it's helpful, but it's also painful. It's a painful read. I'm listening to it, and then I'm reading it, also at home. And I have to take it in small doses. I'll take a couple chapters at a time because there's so much to think about, and because parts of it are painful. Because this is my people that he's talking about. They're his people, and it's there's a lot here, and I think he's right. That's the thing. I feel like so often journalists or anyone writing about a topic, you can kind of tell if they're getting it secondhand, or third hand. He's right. He's been in this culture. He's hitting the right themes. He knows what to leave out. He knows what to put in. It's just so helpful. So I would just highly recommend the book, and I want to talk about it in some depth. So.
Can I underline that?
Yeah.
I just want to put it. Yeah, because I was drawn into his skill as a journalist, but also the how personal he is, and that he's part of a church. His dad was a pastor of a church, and his dad was a pastor of a church almost 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to tell a little bit more of that story, but the credibility is that he has as a journalist is his skill and ability to observe. But also his love for the church.
Yeah.
When you talk about it being hard to listen to, the way a couple of days ago, I just had to put it down. It just was wearing me out. I'm going,
right.
And I,
right.
I get it, maybe. So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's good medicine is what it is. Yeah, if people are willing to engage with it. So where we're going today. We're talking about just the prologue today, and today is a very simple conversation. This is we're going to be talking about our origin stories, Dave and me, in terms of not like where we were born, etc., unless Dave wants to, but I mean our origin stories in terms of what caused each of us to start talking a little more publicly about some of these issues that maybe as pastors we've been pretty careful about how to engage, some of this controversial stuff. What is it that caused each of us to get off the sidelines a little bit? And before we do that, I wanted to have Dave share just a little bit of a conversation that he and I had as we were talking about this series that I think is important at the very beginning to sort of level set where we're coming from. This isn't about beating anyone up. This isn't about demoralizing anyone about the state of the church. We're both church people. We both love the church, but the question I asked Dave was, where do you find hope in all of this? As you're reading a book like this, that's taking a pretty unvarnished look at the church, where do you find hope? And how do we talk about this sort of thing in a way that's helpful to people? And Dave had some thoughts on that. I'd like you to share that, Dave.
Well, the hope, yeah, and I had to think about that a little bit, because I want to make sure that it's the hope we're offering it's not going to be that bad. It's not that bad. I think there's a prophetic voice that needs to be heard, not just from us, but in the church. And the hope that I have in this is that what we're in and what I think is happening is something that's happened before. And I'll just say it like this. From the beginning of the story to the end of the story, the people of God over and over would forget who they were, whose they were, and why they were here. And why they were here has to do with mission. And I mean, you can go back in the Old Testament and the prophets, and every time they would forget who they were, whose they were, why they were here, they would get off mission, and then they would go into exile. I mean, over and over and over again. And when they would, the prophets would start to scream and say, among other things, remember and return, repent. And every time they did remember, they were revived. Revival. And when they were revived, they would, in that revival, they were remembering whose they were. They would remember God. They remember who they were in relation to God. And they were back on mission, which wasn't their comfort. It wasn't making sure they had all the, it was making sure that they were authentically reflecting the life of God to the world. And so to me, the hope is that we're going to remember again. But I think that there's a sense in which a significant part of the evangelical church is in a kind of exile, I think. And it's not even my job to wake everybody up. We even joked that we are probably asleep in some ways. And
right. For sure we are. And when I look back at at my career as a pastor, lots of things that I kind of wish I had talked about, but I didn't know, But anyway, keep going. Yeah.
Well, just the hope is that we've been here before. It helps me, actually, to even have perspective on the church. This is something, there's a pattern of forgetting who and whose and why we're here that is part of being part of this tribe. And I'm talking about not Americans. I'm talking about being evangelical Christians, people of God who belong to Him, who call by His name. But that when we remember, we can be revived, and we will be, I believe. So anyway.
Yeah,
and I'm thinking toward that. That's what I'm kind of, in fact, that's why I would address some of these things, to kind of ring a bell and go, hello.
Right.
Anyway, so, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. By the way, I was thinking as I interrupted you that if you and I specifically get through this, it's a testament to God, of course, but it's a testament to medical science in the form of attention deficit medication. The fact that the two of us could have a conversation like this and keep it on track. So, so this is fun. All right. So I'm going to get into, as we share our story of kind of what got us off the sidelines. I want to start with Tim Alberta's story. I want to share some of this book, since this is about this book. I want to share Tim Alberta's story, and this is from his prologue. So there's a little bit of reading here, but he's a good writer. He paints a good picture, and he is talking about the worst day of his life, where he was in a studio at Christian Broadcasting Network, actually doing an interview. And when he got done with that, he got a phone call that his father had passed away, and his father was the pastor of this church for many, many years. And so the story picks up here where he's now gone home, and he's gone to the funeral. But at the wake, people were coming up to him, and they were ripping him personally a little bit at the wake because Rush Limbaugh had been trashing on Tim Alberta a little bit for some of the things that he was saying about Donald Trump. And so at his father's wake, people were kind of ribbing him about things that Rush Limbaugh was saying about him. And so then Tim Alberta ended up saying some things in his father's eulogy about Rush Limbaugh. And why are you listening to Rush Limbaugh? And why are you bringing that up at my dad's wake? He actually said a couple of things about it, which set some people off. So he's home from the funeral when this scene comes in. And this is sort of where he decided to write this book. So he says, a few hours later, after we had buried Dad, my brothers and I slumped down onto the couches in our parents' living room. We opened some beers and turned on a baseball game. Behind us, in the kitchen, a small platoon of church ladies worked to prepare a meal for the family. Here, I thought, is the love of Christ. Watching them hustle about, comforting Mom and catering to her sons, I found myself regretting the Rush Limbaugh remark. Most of the folks at our church were humble, kind-hearted Christians like these ladies. Maybe I'd blown things out of proportion. Just then, one of them walked over and handed me an envelope. It was left at the church, she said. My name was scrawled across it. I opened the envelope. Inside was a full-page-long handwritten screed. It was from a longtime Cornerstone elder, someone my dad called a friend, a man who mentored me in the youth group and had known me for most of my life. He had composed this note on the occasion of my father's death to express just how disappointed he was in me. I was part of an evil plot, the man wrote, to undermine God's ordained leader of the United States. My criticisms of President Trump were tantamount to treason against both God and country, and I should be ashamed of myself. However, he assured me there was still hope. Jesus forgives, and so does he. If I could use my journalism skills to investigate the deep state, he wrote, uncovering the shadowy cabal that was sabotaging Trump's presidency, then I would be restored. He said he was praying for me. I felt sick. Silently, I passed the letter to my wife. She scanned it without expression. Then, in a violent spasm, she flung the piece of paper into the air and with a shriek that made the church ladies jump out of their cardigans, cried out, "What the hell is wrong with these people?" So I love this woman, by the way. This is a perfect question to ask at that point, but I'll just continue on here. He said, in search of answers to that question, I took Dad's advice and pivoted away from political journalism. There would be no sequel to the Trump book. Moving my young family back to Michigan a few months after the funeral, I knew there was another project that demanded my attention. Dad had implored me to apply my talents to subjects of more eternal significance, and I could think of nothing more eternally significant than the crack-up of the American Evangelical Church. This would not be an examination of Christianity writ large. Whatever the problems plaguing the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Black Church, the rainbow flag-flying progressive church, and there are many, these are distinctive and diverging faith traditions. What I could offer was a window into my faith tradition. It happens to be the tradition that is the most polarizing and the least understood, the tradition that is more politically relevant and domestically disruptive than all the others combined, evangelicalism. So that's sort of how he's setting up the book, and then he delivers on his, promise to investigate these things and talk about them from the perspective of an insider. But this was what got him motivated, that story, where he realized, I just have to talk about this. This is worth spending 4 years of my life researching and writing this book. So, yeah, I just wanted to hear, any thoughts that you have on that in particular, Dave, but then sort of what got you thinking about these things?
Yeah. Well, his story is compelling, and but it's kind of like what I said earlier about what the hope is that he went home and discovered that there was something growing in that church that he didn't know was there, but it was there. And this kind of thing exposed something that I'm guessing was there for a very long time. And I think it's always good to bring things out into the light, what's hidden in the dark. But the problem is that that's often very don't like what we see when people turn on the lights. that's just my comment on his story. I can trace my journey with this thing because I've been thinking about this and in it for about 7 years. I'll never forget where I was early December 2016 because I got a phone call from my nephew Cornell, who wanted to know, and he was a little indignant, I think, on his call or text, whatever it was. It ended up being a call. Started with a text. He wanted to know if I knew that 81% of white evangelicals had voted for Donald Trump. And at the time, I had no idea. I mean, I was still in shock like everybody, like, what? I was comparing it to when Jesse Ventura became our governor. I remember looking at the headline and going, you got to be kidding me. It's kind of how I felt about this. Not really serious, but when he said that, I didn't know 81%. And so my question was, is this even true? And I also think when I said, no, I didn't know, I felt a little defensive because I'm an evangelical pastor, and my nephew Cornell grew up in my church, and it kind of felt like he was blaming me for how people voted. I didn't have anything to do with it. So, leave me alone. But that really did stimulate me. It kind of made me go, I got to figure out what is going on. One, is it true? Because 81% of anything is a lot.
Right.
And, I started wading into it. I go, okay. I know there was a whole bunch of people who voted transactionally. It's kind of that lesser of two evils thing. He'll do this policy, and so I'll give him my vote. That's a transaction. They maybe voted for Trump holding their nose. They weren't, naive or they didn't care about his lack of character, which he obviously had none.
Right.
And so I get that. I don't think I've ever voted for anybody without holding my nose a little bit. Okay.
Right.
So,
yeah.
What was more disturbing and really disturbing was the more I dug and just kind of started listening and reading. I just dove into the deep end on all sorts of books, most of them evangelical scholars, was that there were a number of people, and it seemed to be growing, and it's still there, that far from in voting for Trump in spite of his character flaws, they were voting for him because of his caustic nature, his punch you in the face kind of approach. The most bizarre thing was when I started hearing how he was the Lord's anointed. The script entirely turned. In fact, this was one of Cornell's problems, mine as well, was that here's a kid who has grown up in the evangelical church, happened to be mine, who his whole life has heard that character matters, particularly in public office. I mean, I don't know if you can forget in 1998 when Bill Clinton got involved with Monica Lewinsky.
Oh, yeah.
Leaders were going crazy, and I agreed with them. I mean, the SBC, Southern Baptist Convention, made a big resolution, character matters, and they kind of censured him, called for his resignation. James Dobson was a very loud voice in bringing censure to Clinton, and character matters. And one of the things I remember about Dobson, because I have, since this started for me, kind of gone back and seen some of the things he wrote. And one of them was he was absolutely apoplectic around the end justifies the means. That can't be true, because at the time, evidently, the economy was good. And so who cares about his character? Character matters all the way down to the ground. Just so weird. When in 2016, 2017, that same guy who character matters is telling me that this guy's a baby Christian. Come on.
Right.
What are we, stupid? What?
Right.
They weren't just humming a different tune. They were singing a different song. The whole narrative shifted from character matters to God can use anyone.
And all of that you're talking about from the Clinton years, that was my formational stuff. I mean, I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984 when I just turned 19. But then my real involvement in politics was all during that Clinton era, and I was listening to Rush Limbaugh constantly. I was reading. I was in a right-wing echo chamber in sort of the nascent online sort of things that were happening, chat rooms and stuff like that, even at that time. And so I remember all of that vividly. And believe me, it sounds pretty shocking now to hear how completely that's changed, like you said.
Yeah, and I think the thing I remember then thinking was a little strident. Oh, come on. But I agreed with him. I agreed. The character matters. And I agree, maybe he's not going to resign, but there were some impeachment things that I think happened with Clinton. But what was really hard for me personally was, and then I'm going back to Cornell, because I don't know if I can communicate this well, but Cornell kind of became a type to me as a pastor in my church, and I kind of studied the culture. I think we knew before any of this stuff happened around the political polarization that millennials and the next generation were leaving the church in droves before any of this. And so you get evangelicals flipping on stuff like this and all of a sudden supporting someone who is so obviously, I don't want to be off, I don't think it's a stretch, a vile human being, just a morally bankrupt person, that the damage it's done to the public witness of the church, I don't think it's immeasurable in my mind. I think the Cornells of the world have not lost their faith in Jesus. They want nothing to do with your church. If this is right. And it's hard to argue with that. And to me, when I said about remembering who you are and whose you are and why we're here, because we forget why we're here. I think forgetting the mission is something that's desperately damaging, because the mission, I just gave you two verses, Philippians 4, and there's 1 John 4. 1 John 4 says, no man has seen God at any time. Well, that's a problem. How do you know God if you can't see him? How do we share God with the culture? There he is. How do you do it? But if you love one another, they might just get a glimpse, because nothing has more power on earth to reveal the face of God to the culture than when the people of God reflect in authentic ways the life and love of God. The converse is true as well. Nothing has more power to distort the face of God than when the people of God have no resemblance at all to the God they say they serve. So when we get off mission and we make it about making America great again, you're off mission. I mean, you just lost you're off. The other one is Philippians 4, where Paul says, let your forbearing spirit be known to all men. And I remember preaching that years ago. Had nothing to do with politics or a political connecting of the dots. But I translated it, let your forbearing love be the first thing people see about you. And I remember, this will date it, because I remember the illustration I used was Fred Phelps, Topeka, Kansas, Westboro Baptist Church. They were getting the funerals of gay people with God hates fags signs. So that's the first thing people see. So what do people see in us? And when the church becomes more known for grabbing the power they get when they get into the Oval Office and get the judges they want, okay, I agree with those policies and I hate abortion. But the first thing people see, January 6th, the name of God was everywhere. I'll never forget it. Atlantic Monthly, Emma, I can't remember her last name now. And the name of God being everywhere was not a Sunday school picnic. It was on January 6th. There's a picture, and there's many of these, of that gallows that people wanted to hang Mike Pence from, who happens to be a Christian. And a Jesus Save signs right next to it, and worship music is blaring. And that's like, wow, we're so in so much trouble. Yeah. That's how I got in.
Yeah. No, I can relate. For myself, just the main thing, and I'm sure this is true for you also, the main reason that I decided to start speaking out about this sort of thing was because it was a pastoral concern. Even though I was no longer officially a pastor, I retired in 2016. And but the pastoral concern of watching so many people that I know from my previous church, or even family members who are very sincere believers. What happens, I think, when you're a sincere believer and you're trying to support something that's just really kind of indefensible, is you've got some sort of reasons inside. You might not even know what those reasons are, but there's some reasons inside that you feel like, I have to support this. Sometimes it's fear-based. Sometimes it's based on just a real strong dislike culturally for somebody, some other group or whatever. It could be many different things. So you make these little concessions and you defend the indefensible in this little case, then another one, then another one. And before long, who you really are starts to diverge from your actions. And that creates this cognitive dissonance inside of you. It creates this crisis inside of you. And people have to, at some point, it's not going to last. It's not sustainable to live that way. So what you see is people becoming depressed, angry, not wanting to talk about just really basic truths, because it's like it brings up the fact that they're living in this cognitive dissonance. And also what begins to happen, and what I think we're seeing happen now, is it can go a couple different ways. One way is that you can start to bring your actions and your words back in line with who you are. That's wonderful if that happens. But the opposite can happen, that you start to actually, your character starts to change to be in line with where you're going. And if you believe so strongly in this particular movement, you start to adjust your character to it, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of Christians becoming a lot more strident, a lot more, like what you said, where, a lot of people were holding their nose to vote for Trump because of, the way he treats people, all that sort of thing. But now a lot of people like that. They see that as strong, and their character has actually adjusted. He's actually changed the character of many of his followers. Leadership matters, and evidence of that is what I heard again and again and again in 2016, and then, 2017, 2018 is, well, what, did you want me to vote for Hillary? Right now, there's a primary. And evangelicals, again, a huge number of evangelicals in the primary, where you have a multitude of choices, are choosing Donald Trump. This isn't against Hillary. They chose Donald Trump over Mike Pence. They're choosing him over other people. There's something, the character has actually, it's either been revealed for what it always was, or it's been altered.
I think
but that process, go ahead.
Well, I think what you're poking at was another one of the holy moly's for me. Because one of the things you'll find among people who've bought into this whole thing of Make America Great Again, I think, is they motivate people with fear. And and this is that's like over the top. The Democrats aren't just wrong, they're evil, they're wicked. They eat babies. They some bizarre things, and it's even tied in with some really bad theology about the end of the world, about the coming of Christ, and these are the end times, and really bad exegesis around the Book of Revelation. But there's this fear thing, and because here's one of the tropes. Or the things that gets marched out all the time. They're coming after you. They're coming after you. They're coming after your tax exempt status. They're coming after your church. They're gonna stop all your freedom of religion. And all I can think of is, will somebody remind us of the story? What if they did? What did we do? Fight? Hit them? What did Jesus do? Oh, don't bring Jesus into this. Oh no, you better.
Yeah, this is no time to bring Jesus into it.
We're not.
Stakes are too high. Yeah.
The stakes are so. Yeah, it all of a sudden justifies when you talked about the shift in character. The fact that they're coming after us and we're going to lose America. So we've already lost America. That whole we're a Christian nation. we'll have a longer conversation about that. But
Right. Oh yeah, we're going to be getting into this. Yeah.
for Babylon, it's who we are, and we need to learn. We are Babylon. We are
Right.
Rome. And what as the Christians, believers in Jesus who can make a difference in Babylon are not trying to make Babylon great again, or Rome great again, or America great again. They're trying to figure out, how do I live in Babylon as a follower of Jesus, which will be absolutely counterculture to America and Babylon, particularly with how we do it. I used to say at Open Door all the time, and this wasn't political talk. The whole thing was, are you going to use power over to get what you want, or are we going to demonstrate the love of Jesus in power under? You're not here to be served, but to serve. And the Gentiles lord it over. And my thing was, this was my statement, that if you use a kingdom of this world method, which is punch you in the face, win the fight, if you use a kingdom of this world method, even if it's to achieve what you think is a kingdom of God outcome, if you use a kingdom of this world method, you lose the kingdom. All of it. You're done.
Right.
It's over. You have won nothing, even if you win. And even in the losing thing that's most obvious to me is the loss of public witness. I mean, we're kind of a joke to some people.
So I was a super political person before I went into ministry. And I feel like this is important to understand, that because I feel like I can relate to a lot of the people who this book is talking about. I feel like I was one of those people for a huge part of my life. And so it's important to sort of share a little bit about that for me, politics was huge. Like I said, I was raised in a, Catholic family. So I was raised Catholic, and my, I voted for Ronald Reagan in 1984, like I said, at 19 years old, and very Republican family, conservative family. And so I was super involved in politics. I was very involved in the pro-life movement for years. And I would go into schools and speak on behalf of the pro-life cause. I'd get invited into science classes or health classes, and I would talk about these things. And so that was just a big part of my life before I went into ministry. Like I said, I was in this sort of right-wing echo chamber, listening to Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity on the radio, reading just things that now I recognize as being really conspiratorial type stuff on the internet, on these message boards and stuff in the early days. And so what's important to point out about that is I can relate to the people who come into a church with a set of assumptions already, political assumptions or cultural assumptions, and they're sort of listening for, does the pastor support this? Rather than, when I went to church, I wasn't at that stage listening for, how can I be corrected in my worldview? I was wanting to be built up in my worldview. So I bring this up because
what you think is what is true. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I was at Bethlehem Baptist Church for 6 years with John Piper in sort of my formative years when I was leaving the Catholic Church and becoming an evangelical. And I learned, I have just great memories and great formation that I got from that church and from listening to his preaching. But what's interesting is I had to honestly look at why I was there in the first place. The reason I went to that church, I got invited by a friend in January of 1989, and it happened to be Pro-Life Sunday. And John Piper, this was the first time I heard him preach, gave the most incredible pro-life sermon from the scriptures that I'd ever heard. And just watching him open the Bible and then the passion that he spoke with. And so I just have to admit that anytime that I'm talking, and I'm not criticizing him for that, it was an incredible sermon, but I'm pointing out that when we're talking in this book about people who have these cultural assumptions, these political beliefs, and they're looking to their church to bolster those, that was me in 1989. John Piper won me over with a pro-life message because I was out speaking in schools about it and stuff like that. And it was then that I started to listen to his theology and stuff like that. But the hook at first was the cultural thing. And so I just want to recognize that in myself. And because I think it's human nature. And it's something that it took me years to see through that. The way that I started to come out of this like highly politicized faith was that when I went into ministry myself, I actually recognized within a year or two of being in ministry that all of this political stuff that I was absorbing, reading, was actually it was hardening my heart towards people in my congregation, where we disagreed. And I started to realize, wait a second, this political stuff is in some way taking precedence over the mission that I've been called to. So I actually went cold turkey. So for almost 20 years, I completely stopped listening to talk radio when I went into ministry. I completely stopped. What's that?
Even K-Fan?
Oh, no, sports. I can still do some sports stuff. Okay. Yeah. But, for me, that actually cheers me up. For you as a Bears fan, that's got to be even more demoralizing. But anyway, but the political stuff, I just, I cut it out. I stopped reading all of these right-wing websites. I stopped reading right-wing magazines, and I wouldn't have even called them right-wing at the time. I just recognized that they were taking me down a path that was darkening my soul and making me ineffective in ministry. But what happened, and I didn't even realize this, but over the years, my soul got detoxified of a lot of this political stuff. So, because I have to ask myself, why in 2016 then was I able to look at Donald Trump and just say no? I voted a straight Republican ticket in 2016, except for Donald Trump. I voted third party. And I like my formative years, I was so anti-Clinton that I couldn't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I still had those vestiges of, my past, but I couldn't vote for Trump. But I voted a straight Republican ticket because I was working on this assumption that, these are moral people. A lot of these people are Christians, and they're going to hold him accountable. They're going to, it'll be okay. What activated me to start speaking publicly was month after month and year after year of those people that I trusted, the evangelical leaders, Republican leaders, basically just defending Trump rather than holding him accountable and watching that cave-in happen. So then I did end up speaking out. Starting in like 2018, I think I started to really speak out before that election. And by the 2018 election, I voted a straight Democrat ticket, not because I'm a Democrat, I'm far from it, but I thought the only way that this gets better is if the Republicans see that that people like me will not give them my vote. They have to earn it. They have to earn it through their actions, not just playing on my cultural beliefs. And so that's where I'm at now. I would be politically an independent with a lot of very conservative impulses, but it's also, there've been a lot of my political impulses that have changed too in that 20 years of detoxifying from the echo chamber. You can't pastor a church in the city like I have in the inner city and not be changed by what you experience. So who knows what I am politically, but that's where I came from. And I think it's important to know where I came from because I can relate to the people who are listening to the sorts of people that this book talks about.
Well, I really appreciate that because it helped. I mean, I knew that about you, but you putting it in this context, you'll know how to talk to people who are in that because you maybe even better than me because they never have been politically driven at all. And so, but I've always felt like I knew how to talk to evangelicals. I could see whatever was wrong with us and speak into it, but because I am one. I mean, I am
Yeah,
one.
right.
And, I've been, wounded by some things that are evangelical, but I've been healed by some things. And but I think that when you're in, I don't like it when people are throwing stones from the outside. It doesn't help. And I'm not even wanting to throw
Right.
stones, but I do want to say what I see now. And for me, like talking now, I had to put this down. I mean, my thing has been like in 2016 with that phone call, I started reading and getting a deep dive. And I started to write some stuff, and I kept running into a wall and not being able to finish, and have all sorts of kind of disconnected things. But part of why I put it down for a while and didn't go there was I couldn't talk about it or write about it without being angry, and that ain't
Right.
helpful. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah,
I
anger isn't.
energy and passion, but oh man, I didn't
Right.
want to. You can easily become what you're trying to confront. Um, so anyway,
Yeah, that was the hardest part for me in writing my book in 2020, actually. I wrote this book called Mega Seduction. Um, what was it? Resisting the Debasement of the Christian Conscience. So the hardest part for me in writing that, yeah, yeah, there it is. Thank you. The hardest part for me in writing that book was in maintaining that tone of just making an appeal and not coming across as angry. And as I've reread it, I think I was like 80% on being able to do that. I think looking back, there's about 20% of it. I do sound pretty strident, but 80% of the time it's like I was pulling it off of like, just like really not being angry, but I think
well,
go ahead. Yeah.
well, I was just gonna say we'll be a really good balance because you'll hold me back a little bit, and I'll go, Pat, come on, that's not strident, that's the truth.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah. And one thing that you said that's super important that's shaped everything about how I think about this stuff is that quite often, I think this is just tribalism is a thing. It's super, deep into the human nature, tribalism. But there's something about human beings that we get really angry in general at people who we view as having like somehow betrayed our group, betrayed our tribe or whatever. But like you said, you're not interested in throwing stones at the other, well, this is me too. And this is Jesus. You don't see Jesus, ripping on the Romans. You don't see, the people that Jesus confronted were his own people. He confronted his people. And it wasn't his business to tell the Romans, what was wrong with them. He was confronting his people. And when we do that, it's bound to ruffle some feathers, but it's coming from a place, I think, in both of us and so many of the people I know who are speaking out about what's going on here. It's coming from a place of love for people, love for the church. And sometimes it can sound angry because there are things that happen that do make me angry. But it's from a pastoral concern, and it's from a place of love and heartbroken, brokenness. But that's where I'm coming from as I talk about this stuff. So I wanna just end with there's just a sort of a passage from Tim Alberta's book that I want to end with here that I think is a good thing to meditate on, this paragraph. He's talking again about the Lord's Prayer, the kingdom, the power, and the glory part of it at the end. But this is how I want to end this talk. He says that penultimate verse, the kingdom, the power, and the glory, has haunted me since childhood. Its magnificence can be appreciated only in the context of the possessive pronoun thine. That word, thine, implies something more than mere ownership. It connotes exclusivity. Everything that Satan offered Jesus in the wilderness, by the way, I just have to stop and say, I love that Tim Alberta continually comes back to this temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan, because that's where I started my book. We saw it the same way, that Satan is offering Jesus all the powers in the world and stuff, and Jesus is rejecting that. So I love that he starts his book the same place I started mine, and I thought, wow, we're seeing some things the same. But anyway, so he says,
and you must be a smart guy.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. By the way, if you have to choose between the two books, read Tim Alberta's book. I'm just going to say that just as clearly as I can say. So anyway, everything that Satan offered Jesus in the wilderness to give him power over all the kingdoms of the world and the glory that comes with it, Jesus rejected. Why? Because the only authentic version of those things belongs to God. What the devil tempted Jesus with 2,000 years ago and what he tempts us with today are cheap counterfeits. Amen to that. Amen. So thanks, Dave. And looking forward to the next talk. We're going to take on chapter 1 of this book in the next conversation. So thanks for joining me.